How to produce an indie folk song on Logic Pro X. Hey guys, my name is Sam and I make music under the name This New Light. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I wanted to do a production breakdown of the song that I just put out a few weeks ago. It's called Summer Song. It's got a feature artist with Brittony May, and I thought what I could do today is run you through my Logic project and show you kind of how I've EQ'd things, compressed things, how I've arranged things, and how it's all come together. So before I get into that, I wanted to run through some constraints and considerations that are probably worthwhile mentioning before we get into it. Number one is that I wanted to put the constraint on myself that I could only use a maximum of 50 tracks in the Logic project. Now, for some of you that might sound like a lot, but on projects before, sometimes I've used up to 150 tracks. Now, my music isn't that complicated, but sometimes you just need a sprinkle of magic here and there. Anyway, coming back to this one, I wanted to make sure I only used 50 tracks. Another constraint I put on myself is that I wanted to take a very minimalist approach with my audio treatment, just so that I wouldn't get caught up in excessive amounts of EQing, compressing. My general approach to this song was if it didn't need reverb, don't put it on. Another consideration is that this track has a feature artist, and so for me, getting that blend between the male and female vocal was super important, and so from the get-go, I probably approached the vocals very different to how I normally would. Another consideration is that I really wanted the song to sound like bedroom folk, almost like you were eavesdropping into this conversation between two people. To me, it felt really intimate with the melody and the storyline, and so I wanted it to feel like that in the production too. The last consideration, which is probably more for you guys, is that Hinterland, Medication, and Summer Song were all recorded, produced, mixed, and mastered simultaneously. So they really coexist sonically, and a lot of the decisions I made around EQing and all of that were the same across the board. So let's get into it. So guys, here is my Logic project, and I want to say right from the get-go that to me, it's super important that when I open my Logic session, it's orderly, it's color-coded, and everything is where it's meant to be. So let me quickly show you how I've laid it out. To start with, I've got my vocal group, which consists of a main, a double, a left and right for Brittany's vocal, a harmony which comes in later on, and some falsetto vocals that come in at the bridge just to add some extra atmosphere. For my guitars, I've got the nylon string panned slightly left and right, which later on becomes centered. Then you can see I've got an acoustic Epiphone there, panned left and right. I've got banjo panned hard left and right, which comes in right on verse 2. There's some swells with an ebow that I recorded on an electric guitar. And then there's some bass and long chords that come in the interlude. If we jump down to the miscellaneous section, I've got some outtakes of me whistling. There's also a conversation that Brittany had, which I kept recording after a vocal take, and we were just chatting about a music video idea that we had, and so I've kept that in the interlude because I thought it was a really cool texture. I've done a lot to the processing of that, so I'll show you a bit later. Then I've got some flugelhorn takes from an old TNL song about 4 or 5 years ago that I repurposed, and then later on that becomes a synthesizer, which sounds quite like trumpety, but I'll show you the processing on that too. Then I've got a live upright piano, which I recorded at my friend Julian's studio in Biwa, and a tiny little melody that literally only happens once. For the drums, it's probably the most simple arrangement I have ever done. There's literally just one drum pack that I got all these sounds from, and it's one section of just 4 on the floor kick, and then another section where the hi-hat and snares come in. So it's all pretty straightforward, and that's how I've grouped it. Another thing that's important to mention is I normally like having the arrangement markers right up the top, because for me that just gives me clarity around what section I'm in and what section I need to be working on. Alright, let's get into the specifics and we'll have a listen to the vocals, how I've processed them and kind of blended them together.
Oh, summer, where'd you go? Your warmth is headed for the hills.
So, right from the get-go, you'll notice that there's not a lot of reverb on these vocals, and that's because, again, I want to come back to the bedroom folk kind of vibe. To me, it's really important to just get that right from the start. So with my EQing, I took out a lot of the highs because I didn't want it to sound super poppy. I wanted it to sound, again, a bit DIY, a bit home studio. I was recording this on an Altron mic, which I'll just drop a little photo right here. I don't know exactly what model it is, but to me, it just sounds really sharp and like a bit crunchy on the high ends. So I pretty much cut out all of that in the EQing. With the compressor, I've just got this free plugin, which I think is absolutely incredible. I downloaded this from the Lander website and I use it on pretty much everything at the moment. My main comment is that I love that there's only 2 parameters here. It's got a squeeze and an output level, and I pretty much only use those 2 things. There's a tiny bit of EQ that you can add, but for me, I'm doing that already, so I don't actually need it. After that, I've got some pitch correction, which I've dialed back quite a bit because again, I didn't want it to sound too poppy or polished. And then right at the end, we've got a Valhalla vintage verb. I think this plugin costs around $150 for the verb and the delay, and I put this on everything. You'll notice that there's only 1.67 seconds of reverb, so it's really not that obvious, and the mix is only 8%. So it's very subtle, it's not doing a whole lot, and that just adds to the bedroom folk vibe. The only other thing that I think is worth mentioning here is that Brit's vocals, obviously, she has a bit more airiness and high end to hers, so I cut out even more of her high end on this EQ, and that's just because I wanted it to sound really glued. Later on, we have a harmony that comes in verse 2, and in the bridge, I want to show you the really airy falsetto vocals that I added to give us some more width.
Time keeps rolling on. In autumn, I get caught up in the rush of it all.
We'll stop it there. Yeah, I really like how that sounds. Again, it probably doesn't sound perfect with EQ and compression, but I kind of like that and it works for the song. All right, let's jump ahead to the guitars. This is probably a lot of the meat and potatoes of the song. Before I show you this, I wanted to jump back to an older version of the song where I recorded a different guitar for the main part. This is actually a 1960s Hofner electric guitar. It sounds really jangly, but for some reason I thought it might work on this track. It definitely didn't, but here's a bit of a reference point for what it sounded like.
Oh, summer, where'd you go? Your warmth is headed for the hills.
So already you can see it sounds a little bit less intimate, a little less warm, and that just didn't really work for the song. So we stuck with the nylon. I'll play you a bit of that. Right at the beginning, you can hear me sitting down to play, and I think that's really cool for the bedroom folk thing. Again, sorry, I'm saying that a lot, but I think it's super important to say with this song. You can hear that the guitars aren't perfectly in time, and I think that just adds to the charm. The processing here is a little bit complicated, and I don't know why I added 3 EQs here, but I've cut out all the highs on this first one and most of the lows, and then for some reason boosted it on the second one. So I don't quite know how that's had an effect on the sound, but I'm sticking with it and I probably don't want to change it. The other thing is I cut out a bunch of frequencies that were coming through that sounded really unpleasant, but I do want to say that my EQing on tracks now is a lot better, a lot more refined, and I don't normally have this kind of excessive amounts of plugins. After that, we've got the Corv Presser, great plugin, and someone suggested that I put a tape emulation plugin on it just so it again sounds a little out of tune, a little quirky, and like it's been recorded in a bedroom. This is a free plugin, I highly recommend you get it. I don't use tape emulation all that often, but it really helped to make this nylon sound special. I'm going to drop us in coming into verse 2 where you can hear a bit of a slide coming in. The banjos arrive and also the acoustic guitar. You can hear straight away that those banjos are actually really out of tune, but honestly, I kind of think it adds to the track. I bought this banjo a day before I needed to record it, and so I did almost no processing to it because I had no idea what to do. Essentially, I've just cut out the lows there and let the banjo do the rest. This is a really good opportunity to show you that double tracking really does bring character to a track. This is what it would sound like if we just had one banjo right in the middle, and you're gonna notice straight away it just sounds a little average. Versus this. Straight away, the difference is super obvious, and for me, that's kind of the approach I take with a lot of guitars. I think it just adds a lot of width and a lot of depth to what you're doing, so a great opportunity to do more double tracking in your own music. The only other thing that I really want to talk about here is the EBow is an awesome piece of equipment. I'll drop a little photo right here. It costs around 250 bucks, but it essentially turns your electric guitar into a string instrument that you can play and have a sustained note go for as long as you want. It's really good for swells and using for like crescendos, moving into different sections. Later on, we also have the bass play a bit of a melody and the electric guitars come in, so I'll show you what that sounds like. Pretty cool. I love how that sounds, and I think I never would have thought to do that, but I think it's just a really cool way of bringing all the guitars together. Alright, let's jump down to Miscellaneous. This is kind of all the quirky bits of the song, and as I said, most of these audio files were actually outtakes, which ended up being really nice. I'll start with the whistling and the talking because I think it's really cool. This is just a tiny little outtake in between my vocals. It's pretty rough, but I like how it sounds in the mix. And then we've also got these two talking tracks, which literally just give you like this disorientating conversation feel. So essentially all I've done is I've taken an audio clipping from one section and an audio clipping from another. I've dropped them on top of each other and panned them left and right, and it just gives you this cool conversation feel. I've also EQ'd all the lows out and all the highs just so it sounds really muted, and that's pretty much it. Now, if we have a listen to the flugel takes, again, these are repurposed, so they probably sound quite grainy and processed, but to me, there's still that really beautiful texture that we captured 4 years ago that stands in this song now. Let's have a listen. I think that tone is really cool, and that's why I've always loved the flugelhorn, because it kind of sounds like a trombone and a trumpet put together. But what's really cool later in the song is I introduce this thing called the Cheese Machine 2 plugin. It sounds like a trumpet, but a lot more processed and whack. This plugin is absolutely free. I found it on some weird part of the internet, and in really specific situations, it sounds great. So let's have a listen to the interlude going into the bridge where this changeover happens. So it still kind of sounds like a trumpet, but obviously a lot more processed, and I think that just sounds really cool to lift into the bridge. If I was going to do this track again, I probably would have put either tremolo or chorus on that, just so that it has a bit more rhythm and maybe cuts through a bit more, but it still does the job it needs to. Then right down the bottom we have piano, which I recorded live on an upright piano. Having the piano on this track brings so much life into the song because you can hear the mechanisms moving and you can literally picture the bedroom it's being recorded in. I think that's so cool, and I'm really glad I dropped that in. Alright, now we come to the drums, which is super straightforward. I downloaded Jack Reed's Dead Drums Volume 3 off the internet, and I think it cost around 70 bucks. And I've absolutely loved using that sample pack. It sounds very real, it sounds very muted, And I've literally just plonked it straight in and arranged like a little drum groove. I've added in a sub kick underneath the live one from Splice, just because the live one didn't feel like it gave me enough low end. And I've put in a little riser, which is essentially just white noise with a crescendo in and a decrescendo out with heaps of reverb. And then I've just bounced that out to be its own audio file. So pretty much all of that is really straightforward. There's a drum bus that has some reverb, but again, that's really minimal. It's like 2.5 seconds, but a very low mix. So essentially that's the track. And I think the only other thing that's really worth mentioning here is how I set up my master bus. So in Logic, you can do this thing where you just like turn stereo out on, and then you get this little master track. It helps if you want to do automation overall, but what I use it mainly for is putting compression and EQing on the overall track as you're mixing. So for me, what I do is I chuck on this core compressor again, I squeeze it by about 10 decibels just so everything's a bit more flat, and then I also do a channel EQ, which is going to boost a bit of the low end and a tiny bit of the highs. For me, that's really important for like pre-mastering, because it means I kind of know how it's going to sit in the end. And I'll actually export that with the compressor and EQ on the master bus, because I think that's the best representation of how the song is meant to sound. I'll then upload it to Lambda Mastering, and within about 10 minutes, I'll have my finished master. So that's a wrap on my production breakdown. To me, the most important things to remember are use plugins that you're familiar with and you know they work. Do a lot of doubling and panning so you get a lot of that depth on your guitars and vocals. And lastly, organize your Logic session so it's easy to use and inspiring when you open it up. The worst thing is opening up a project that genuinely makes you dread having to finish it off. Once again, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope that no matter where or whenever you are, you're having a great day. I'll catch you next time.